Welcome to a story that begins not with magic, but with the absence of it. Tonight, we are going to travel through the life of a man who had to lose everything he thought he was before he could discover everything he was capable of becoming. This is the story of Dr. Strange, surgeon, scholar, sorcerer, and guardian of a world that will never fully understand what he sacrificed to protect it. So settle in now, and let your breathing slow, and allow the details of your own day to soften and recede. There's nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to remember. There is only this story, told gently and without hurry, unfolding at exactly the pace that a long night's rest requires. The journey from a hospital in New York City to the ancient halls of Kamar-Taj and beyond into the farthest reaches of the multiverse is one worth taking slowly, with care and with attention to everything that made the man before the magic. Rest now and listen, and let the story carry you. Stephen Vincent. Strange arrived in the world already marked for extraordinary things, though the world around him had no particular way of knowing it yet, and neither for many years did he. He was born into a family of modest means and considerable intellectual ambition, the kind of household where books were treated as the most reliable form of currency, and where the dinner table conversation regularly moved between scientific principles and philosophical questions that most families would have considered too abstract for everyday life. His father was a man of careful, methodical intelligence, the sort of person who approached every problem with patience and precision, who believed that almost anything could be understood if a person was willing to spend enough time with it. His mother was warmer in her manner, but equally serious in her engagement with the world, possessed of a curiosity that she passed to her children, along with a deep conviction that the mind was the most valuable thing a person could cultivate. Stephen absorbed both of these influences and transformed them into something that was entirely his own, a quality of intelligence that was not merely sharp but comprehensive, not merely quick but sustained. From his earliest years in school, it was apparent to the people around him that he was operating at a different level than his peers, processing information faster, making connections that others simply did not see, retaining with perfect clarity the details that most students had to struggle to memorize. His teachers responded to this with the mixture of admiration and slight unease that exceptional children so often produce in the adults responsible for their development. He made them feel, without ever intending to, that they were not quite keeping pace with him. This early experience of being ahead of his context, of finding the world around him perpetually insufficient to his capacities, shaped Stephen Strange in ways that would take decades to fully understand. It is not difficult, looking back on his early life with the generous perspective that time allows, to trace the exact path from gifted child to arrogant adult. The arrogance was not a flaw that arrived from nowhere. It was a structure that he built from the materials available to him, the consistent message that he was exceptional, the repeated experience of being right when others were wrong, the absence of any significant failure to teach him that his gifts were not the same thing as his worth. He was praised so consistently and so thoroughly for what he could do that he gradually came to believe that what he could do was what he was. By the time he arrived at medical school, he had already developed the particular manner that would characterize him throughout his surgical career, a manner that his colleagues would describe, depending on their generosity, as confident or arrogant, as precise or dismissive, as brilliant or insufferable. The truth, as it always is, was somewhat more complicated than any of these descriptions could contain. Stephen Strange was genuinely brilliant, with a capacity for understanding anatomical complexity and surgical technique that placed him in a category that most of his professors had encountered only a handful of times across their entire careers. He was also, without question, arrogant. But the arrogance was not the hollow posturing of someone who knows they have something to prove. It was the settled, almost calm certainty of someone who has learned through long experience that they are the most capable person in any given room. Medical school suits people like Stephen Strange in certain specific ways, and fails them in others. The intellectual demands of the curriculum are exactly the kind of challenge that a mind like his finds genuinely engaging, and he moved through the coursework with a speed and ease that astonished even those who had known him before. The clinical training, the development of surgical technique, the accumulation of hands-on experience that turns a student of medicine into a practitioner of it. These things he pursued with something approaching obsession, spending hours in the simulation suite when other students were sleeping. practicing the specific movements of complex procedures until they became as natural as breathing. His hands, which would become the most important things in his world, and then the most devastating loss in it, were extraordinary instruments from the beginning, steady and precise and possessed of an almost preternatural sensitivity to the information available in living tissue. What medical school could not give him, and what he did not think to seek out for himself, was any meaningful understanding of the emotional dimension of medicine. Not the bedside manner that gets taught in communication seminars, not the professional empathy that is a skill to be practiced, but the genuine understanding that the people who came to him as patients were not problems to be solved, but human beings in the full complexity of their fear and hope and suffering. Stephen Strange was not cruel to his patients. He was simply not particularly interested in them as people. What interested him was the puzzle they presented, the specific technical challenge of their condition, the opportunity to exercise his skills at the highest level. When he solved the puzzle successfully, he felt satisfaction. When the outcome was poor, he felt frustration. The emotional lives of the people on either side of those outcomes existed at a remove from his attention that he did not notice because he had never been taught to look. His career after residency rose with the speed that everyone who knew him had predicted. He joined a prestigious surgical practice in New York City, and within a relatively short period had established himself as one of the foremost neurosurgeons in the country. Someone whose name was spoken with a particular kind of reverence in the specialized community of people for whom the brain's most delicate structures were the primary territory of professional life. The cases that came to him were the difficult ones, the cases that other surgeons had declined or failed, the patients who had been told there was nothing more that conventional medicine could offer and who had somehow found their way to Stephen Strange as a kind of last resort. He had a gift for seeing solutions in situations that appeared to have none, for identifying the precise angle of approach that made the impossible merely very difficult, and then executing that approach with a steadiness and control that made watching him work feel almost like an aesthetic experience. The lifestyle that accompanied this level of success was exactly what might be expected of someone who had always measured his worth in external terms. His apartment in Manhattan was the kind of place that communicated achievement before a visitor had time to take off their coat, filled with carefully chosen objects that reflected his taste and his travels, and his comfortable certainty that beautiful things were a natural reward for exceptional work. His watch collection, his tailored suits, his collection of rare medical texts, each of these things was genuinely appreciated rather than merely displayed, but they were also, unmistakably, evidence. Evidence of who he was, evidence of what he had built, evidence presented at all times to himself and to everyone who entered his world that Stephen Strange was someone who mattered. His relationships during this period of his life were numerous but not particularly deep, a pattern that followed naturally from the fact that he had never quite learned to be genuinely interested in other people for their own sake. He was charming in the way that brilliant, confident people are often charming, witty and attentive in the specific moments when his attention was available, capable of making people feel briefly that they were the most interesting person in the room. But the attention was rarely sustained, and the intimacy that might have developed from sustained attention was therefore rarely achieved. The people who cared about him during these years did so in full knowledge that they were choosing to care about someone who would not prioritize them, and many of them eventually chose otherwise. There were colleagues who admired him without warmth, who respected his skill while finding his manner impossible to enjoy. There were subordinates who feared him, and interns who idolized him, and a small number of people who had known him long enough and well enough to see past the arrogance to the genuine brilliance and even genuine kindness that existed beneath it, waiting for conditions that would allow it to emerge. Among this small number was Christine Palmer, a fellow physician whose intelligence and warmth and principled refusal to be impressed by Stephen's reputation had, over time, produced the closest thing to genuine friendship that he maintained. She cared about him in the clear-eyed way of someone who has studied a complicated person for long enough to understand what they might become, if only the right circumstances presented themselves. Stephen Strange, at the height of his surgical career, was, in the most precise sense, someone who had not yet become himself. He was performing a version of who he was, performing it brilliantly, with total conviction, in a performance so thorough that he had forgotten it was a performance at all. The man who would eventually stand in the ancient halls of Kamar-Taj and learn to see with something other than his eyes was present in this earlier version of himself only as a possibility, as a capacity waiting to be unlocked by exactly the kind of catastrophic loss that no one would ever choose, and that would, in the end, give him everything that actually mattered. The life that Stephen Strange had built with such precision and such confidence came apart on a winter evening that began like any other, in the particular way that catastrophic things so often do, not announced by any premonition or atmospheric shift, but arriving quietly inside the ordinary texture of an ordinary night, as though the universe had decided that the most devastating lessons are best delivered without warning. He had been driving along a coastal road in the hours after a long and successful day, the kind of day that confirmed everything he already believed about himself and his place in the world. The details of the drive itself were unremarkable, the dark water visible beyond the guardrail, the curve of the road catching in the headlights. The particular quality of late evening when fatigue and satisfaction combine into something that feels almost like peace. He was reviewing a case in his mind, turning over the specific technical challenges of a procedure he was considering, his attention distributed in the way it always was between the world immediately in front of him and the interior landscape of his professional thinking. And then, in the space between one ordinary moment and the next, the car left the road. The accident itself was brief in the way that accidents always are, a compression of time so extreme that the mind cannot fully process what is happening until it is already over. The vehicle went through the guardrail and down the embankment and into the water below with a violence that the body registers before the consciousness does. A sequence of impacts and forces that the nervous system records with perfect fidelity, while the thinking mind is still trying to understand what has begun. Stephen Strange survived the accident, which is the fact that matters, and which the retrospective telling of his story allows to be stated plainly and without drama, as a settled thing rather than an uncertain one. He survived, and he was pulled from the wreckage, and he was transported to a hospital, and the people who worked to save his life did so successfully. These are the broad facts of the night, and they are sufficient. What the broad facts do not contain, and what matters far more to the understanding of who Stephen Strange would eventually become, is the specific nature of what the accident took from him. His hands, those extraordinary and carefully cultivated instruments that had defined his identity and his purpose, and his entire understanding of his own worth, were damaged in the crash with a thoroughness that the initial medical assessment struggled to convey in terms that felt adequate to the reality. The bones of both hands were broken in multiple places, in the complex and delicate architecture of the carpal and metacarpal structures, where the precision of surgical work is determined, where the difference between the movement required and the movement possible is measured in fractions that most people would never be able to perceive. The nerve damage was extensive. The vascular damage was significant. The surgical teams who worked on him through the night were skilled and dedicated, and did everything that could be done, and what could be done was considerable, and it was not enough. The prognosis that emerged from the first weeks of his hospitalization was delivered to him in the careful, measured language that physicians use when they are trying to be honest without being cruel, which is a language Stephen Strange himself had used many times, and which he now encountered from the other side of the conversation for the first time in his life. His hands would recover some function. The bones would heal according to the normal processes of healing. The nerves, which are slower and less reliable in their regeneration than other tissues, would recover to a degree that was difficult to predict with precision. What his treatment team could tell him, with the honesty that he demanded from them and that they owed him, was that the specific level of fine motor control required for neurosurgery, the extraordinary steadiness and sensitivity and precision that had set him apart from every other surgeon in his field, was almost certainly beyond what his damaged hands would ever again be capable of producing. Stephen Strange received this information in the way that a person receives information that they are not yet able to fully believe, which is to say that he received it intellectually, processed it in the part of his mind that understands words and their meanings, and then set it aside in the particular interior space where things that cannot be accepted are stored until they become unavoidable. He asked precise questions about the mechanisms of nerve regeneration. He requested the relevant literature. He identified specialists in hand reconstruction and nerve repair, whose names he knew from the professional world he had inhabited, people whose work he had followed and whose expertise he respected, and he began the process of consulting them with the same methodical thoroughness he had always brought to complex medical problems. He approached his own devastation as though it were a puzzle, because the puzzle framing was the only one available to him. And because as long as the puzzle remained unsolved, there was still the theoretical possibility that a solution existed. The first specialist he consulted was a hand surgeon in New York, whose reputation was considerable and whose assessment was, in its essential conclusions, consistent with what his treatment team had already told him. The second was a nerve specialist in Boston, who had published extensively on the outer boundaries of peripheral nerve regeneration, and who examined him with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what was being asked, and what the honest answer required. The third was a reconstructive surgeon in London, whose experimental approaches to tendon and ligament repair had produced outcomes that the conventional literature considered remarkable. Each of these consultations required travel that his recovering body found difficult, and that his pride found in a different way. Even more difficult, the experience of being the patient rather than the physician, of sitting in examination rooms and answering questions about his symptoms and his limitations, of having his hands examined by other people's hands with the clinical detachment that he himself had always brought to such examinations. The assessments he received varied in their specifics and their emphasis, but converged on the same essential territory. There was meaningful recovery available to him. There were procedures that might improve his outcome beyond what the initial prognosis had suggested. There were therapeutic approaches and surgical interventions and experimental protocols that were worth pursuing, and he pursued all of them with the exhaustive commitment of someone who has decided that failure is not an option, even when the evidence strongly suggests otherwise. He underwent additional surgeries. He endured months of physical therapy that required him to perform exercises of agonizing slowness and repetition, rebuilding the range of motion and the strength in structures that had been rebuilt themselves from damage. He tracked his progress with the obsessive precision of someone who needs numbers to confirm what his hands could already tell him, that the improvement was real and that it was not enough. The tremor that remained in his hands after all of this work was not dramatic. It was not the kind of tremor that an observer would necessarily notice in the context of ordinary life. It was small and intermittent and manifested most clearly under conditions of fine motor demand, which is to say that it manifested exactly when it mattered most, exactly in the territory where his identity and his purpose had always resided. He tested himself regularly against the standards of his former work, using the simulation equipment that allowed a surgeon to practice procedures without a living patient, and the results of these tests were consistent and unambiguous. The precision that had made him extraordinary was gone. The work that had given his life its meaning and its structure, and its entire sense of purpose, was no longer available to him, and no amount of additional intervention was going to change that fundamental fact. The financial dimension of this period added its own particular quality of pressure to the psychological crisis that Stephen Strange was still, not fully allowing himself to acknowledge. The consultations and procedures and experimental treatments had been expensive in the way that the best medical care is always expensive, and he had pursued all of them without any particular regard for cost because cost had never previously been a constraint he needed to consider. His income as a practicing neurosurgeon had been substantial, and his lifestyle had expanded naturally to fill the space that income provided, and now the income had stopped and the lifestyle had not yet contracted to meet the new reality, and the savings that had seemed ample were being consumed at a rate that would, if the pattern continued, eventually produce consequences he was not yet willing to contemplate. He could have accepted other roles in medicine. His knowledge and his reputation remained intact even as his surgical capacity was lost, and there were positions available to someone with his credentials and his history that would have provided both income and professional engagement, teaching positions, consulting roles, administrative responsibilities within hospital systems that valued his experience and his name. These options were offered to him by colleagues who genuinely wanted to help, who could see the shape of his situation clearly, and who proposed these alternatives with the kindness and tact that the situation required. He declined all of them. He declined with the particular kind of intransigence that belongs to someone who cannot yet accept that the life they define themselves by is genuinely over, who believes at some level still not fully conscious that accepting a different kind of professional life would be the same thing as admitting defeat. The apartment that had once felt like evidence of his achievement began, during this period, to feel like a different kind of evidence entirely, evidence of how far the distance was between who he had been and who he was becoming, between the confident and purposeful surgeon who had chosen every object in those rooms and the diminished and directionless person who now moved through them without quite knowing what he was supposed to be doing there. He still wore the watches for a while, and then he stopped wearing them because the hands of his watches kept time with a steadiness that his own hands no longer possessed, and the contrast was more than he could absorb with equanimity. Christine Palmer came to see him during this period with the regularity and the patience of someone who has decided to remain present, regardless of whether her presence is welcomed, which it was not always. She brought food sometimes, and conversation always, and the particular quality of honest attention that she had always offered him, the refusal to treat him as more fragile than he was, combined with a genuine care for his well-being that asked nothing of him in return. He was not, during these months, at his best with the people who offered him kindness. The arrogance that had always been present in his character had been transformed by suffering into something sharper and less mediated, a bitterness that he directed outward, because directing it inward would have required a reckoning he was not yet capable of undertaking. What he could not have known, in those long and difficult months following the accident, was that the devastation he was living through was not simply an ending. It was a particular kind of preparation, the specific dismantling of a self that had been built on the wrong foundation, necessary and complete and utterly without mercy, as genuine transformation so often is. The hands that could no longer perform surgery would eventually learn to do things that surgery had never imagined. The identity that had been destroyed in the crash along the coastal road would eventually be replaced by something larger and more durable and more genuinely his own. But that knowledge was not available to him yet. What was available to him, in these early months of his loss, was only the loss itself, thorough and unrelenting, and for now, without any visible end. The months that followed the accident settled into a particular rhythm that was not quite routine and not quite chaos, but something that occupied the difficult territory between them, days shaped by the absence of structure rather than by any chosen purpose, long hours in the apartment that had once felt like a reward and now felt something closer to a container for everything he could not bring himself to examine directly. Stephen Strange moved through this period the way that people move through experiences they have not yet accepted as real, with a quality of suspension, of waiting for the moment when the circumstances would reveal themselves to have been temporary, when the situation would resolve into something more consistent with the life he had always expected to be living. That resolution did not come, and the waiting for it, which stretched from weeks into months and from months into something longer still, produced its own particular kind of damage. Not the sharp, immediate damage of the accident itself, but the slower and in some ways more thorough damage of hope maintained past the point where the evidence supports it, of energy directed continuously toward a future that is not arriving. The pride that had always been the most defining quality of Stephen Strange's character became, during this period, the primary obstacle to his recovery, and it is worth dwelling on this for a moment with the gentleness that genuine understanding requires. Pride of the kind that Stephen possessed is not simply vanity, not merely the shallow desire for praise or recognition that the word sometimes implies. It is something more structural than that, a deep identification of the self with its capabilities, a conviction so thoroughly integrated into the personality that it does not feel like a belief at all, but simply like a fact, like the ground beneath one's feet. When that identification is intact, the pride feels like confidence, like self-knowledge, like the appropriate recognition of genuine gifts. When the capabilities that anchored it are taken away, the pride has nowhere to go, and it turns, almost inevitably, into something harder and less generous. He could not accept help because accepting help would have required acknowledging that he needed it, and acknowledging that he needed it would have required a confrontation with the distance between who he had been and who he now was, a distance that he was measuring constantly and in exquisite detail, and that he was simultaneously refusing to look at directly. This combination of obsessive awareness and deliberate avoidance is one of the more exhausting psychological positions a person can occupy, and it exhausted him, visibly and continuously, in ways that the people who cared about him could see clearly and could do almost nothing about. Christine Palmer continued to visit with the faithfulness that had always characterized her affection for him, and he continued to receive her visits with the mixture of genuine gratitude and poorly concealed irritability that represented, in this period of his life, the closest he could come to warmth. She understood this about him with the clear-eyed comprehension of someone who has chosen to care about a difficult person and has made their peace with what that choice entails. She did not require him to be grateful in any demonstrative way. She did not ask him to be better than he was capable of being on any given day. She came, and she stayed for as long as he could tolerate company, and she left without making him feel that her departure was a judgment, and she came again. This consistency, which he did not deserve, and did not acknowledge with anything approaching adequate appreciation, was one of the small things that kept him tethered to the world during the period when the tether was most at risk of fraying entirely. The former colleagues who reached out during the early months of his absence from surgical practice did so with the well-intentioned awkwardness that people bring to contact with someone whose life has been catastrophically altered, not quite knowing how to address the situation directly and therefore often not addressing it at all, filling their communications with professional news and social pleasantries that circled the central fact without approaching it. Stephen responded to these communications with decreasing frequency and increasing brevity, and eventually largely stopped responding at all, not out of any particular animosity toward the people who sent them, but because each message was a reminder of the world he had been part of and could no longer inhabit, and the accumulation of reminders was more than his current emotional capacity could process without cost. The professional community that had celebrated him during his years of practice registered his absence with the particular speed that busy professional communities always demonstrate, which is to say that within a relatively short time the conversations that had once routinely included his name simply adjusted to his absence, the way water adjusts to the removal of a stone, closing over the space without drama, as though the space had never been occupied. This was not cruelty. It was simply the way of things, the ordinary indifference of ongoing life to the specific griefs of individual people. But Stephen Strange, who had spent his career at the centre of attention and regard, experienced it as something that felt very much like being erased. The financial situation, which had been a source of abstract concern in the earlier months following the accident, became during this period a source of concrete and specific pressure, as the gap between his expenditures and his income reached a point that could no longer be managed through the comfortable accounting adjustments he had initially made. The savings that had once seemed more than sufficient were being consumed steadily by the costs of ongoing treatment, by the expenses of the lifestyle he had not yet dismantled, and by the various additional consultations and experimental protocols he continued to pursue with a tenacity that was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from desperation. He sold the first of the watches with the careful reasoning of someone who believes the sale to be temporary, a practical measure taken against a temporary situation that will soon improve. Then he sold another. The apartment, which he could not yet bring himself to leave because leaving it would have felt like the final admission of defeat, became something he paid for with diminishing resources and increasing anxiety. He ate less well than he had and slept less soundly, and moved through the rooms of his life with the quality of someone going through motions whose original purpose has been lost. The physical therapy that had once been the focus of his days became less consistent as the evidence of its limitations accumulated, as the gap between the recovery it was producing and the recovery he required became impossible to account for with optimism alone. He still performed the exercises for a while, with the obsessive precision of someone who needs the ritual even after the belief in its efficacy has begun to erode. And then he performed them less often, and then less often still, until they occupied almost no space at all in the long and structureless days that had become the primary texture of his existence. The reading that had always been one of the genuine pleasures of his life, the medical literature that he had consumed with appetite throughout his career, the broader scientific reading that had kept his intellectual world larger than his professional specialty alone, became during this period almost impossible to sustain. He would pick up texts and find that the concentration required to engage with them was not available, that his attention kept sliding from the page back to the specific calculations he was constantly performing about his situation, the mental arithmetic of loss that produced the same answers every time, and that he could not stop performing regardless. He tried, occasionally, to write, to contribute to the medical literature in ways that did not require his hands to be what they had been, and found that the attempt felt like wearing someone else's clothes, the wrong size and the wrong shape, nothing like the thing he was reaching for. What he would not do, during this entire extended period, was accept any of the professional alternatives that were offered to him. The teaching position at the medical school that had trained him was offered through a former mentor who made the approach with considerable delicacy and genuine respect, framing the opportunity in terms of the contribution Stephen could make, rather than in terms of what the position might offer him. He declined it within a day of receiving the offer, with a brevity that did not acknowledge the care with which the offer had been constructed. A consulting role with a medical technology company, working on the development of surgical instruments, was presented to him by a colleague who understood his financial situation and had gone to some trouble to create an opportunity that might appeal. He declined that as well. These declinations were not made with any clear articulation of the reasons behind them, because the reasons were not ones he was prepared to examine directly. The knowledge, operating beneath the level of conscious thought, that accepting these alternatives would mean accepting that the life he had defined himself by was genuinely finished. And so the long withdrawal continued, with the particular self-reinforcing quality of isolations that feed on themselves, the withdrawal making him less capable of the connection that might have interrupted it, the isolation deepening the despair that made the withdrawal feel necessary, the despair making each passing day more difficult to navigate in ways that made the following day still more challenging. He was not, during this period, someone who would have used the word despair about his own situation, because the word implied a surrender that his pride would not permit him to acknowledge. He would have described himself, if pressed, as someone working through a setback with the methodical determination that had always characterized his approach to difficult problems. The description was not quite a lie. It was simply insufficient, a frame too small for the picture it was trying to contain. The rumours reached him gradually, in the oblique way that information tends to reach people who have largely withdrawn from the networks through which information flows. He heard first, from a source he considered barely credible, about a man with a spinal injury so severe that the medical consensus had placed his prognosis entirely outside the range of meaningful recovery, who had travelled to Nepal and returned walking. He dismissed this with the reflexive skepticism of a scientist encountering an extraordinary claim without extraordinary evidence, filed it in the category of wishful thinking and confirmation bias, and did not return to it consciously for some time. Then he encountered another account, different in its specifics but similar in its essential shape. Someone whose condition the conventional medical world had declared permanent and irreversible, whose situation had somehow shifted in ways that defied the mechanisms available to explain them, and then another. He did not believe these accounts. His training and his temperament and his long investment in the materialist framework of scientific medicine made belief in them feel like a betrayal of everything he had built his understanding of the world upon. But he was also, by this point, a man who had exhausted every option that his framework could offer him, who had followed every legitimate pathway to its end, and found that the end was not where he needed to go. The accounts he was dismissing were not evidence of anything he was prepared to accept, but they were the last thread available to him, in a situation where all the other threads had run out, and Stephen Strange, for all his pride and all his skepticism and all his carefully maintained investment in the idea that he was someone who dealt only in what could be proven, was also, beneath all of that, someone who was not quite ready to stop looking for a way forward. The thread was insufficient. It was also all there was. And in the long quiet of another structureless evening in the apartment that had once felt like evidence of his success, he began, very slowly, and without yet fully admitting to himself that he was doing so, to follow it. The decision to follow the thread to Nepal was not made in any single moment of clarity or resolve. It accumulated, the way that decisions made under duress so often do, through a gradual shifting of internal weight from one side to the other, until the day arrived when the weight had moved far enough that action became more possible than continued stillness. Stephen Strange booked the flights with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, researching routes and logistics with the thoroughness of someone who needs the planning to feel like competence, who needs the structure of preparation to hold at bay the awareness that what he is preparing for does not fit inside any category his training has given him. He told almost no one where he was going, partly because the explanation would have required acknowledging the depth of his desperation, and partly because he was not entirely certain, even as he packed his bag and arranged for the minimal ongoing expenses his diminished life still required. that he was doing anything other than making a very expensive and very undignified mistake. The journey itself was long in the way that journeys to the other side of the world are long, measured not just in hours, but in the particular quality of displacement that accumulates as the familiar recedes and the unfamiliar has not yet become real. He sat in the narrow economy seat, the first time in many years that he had not travelled in the manner his income had previously permitted, and looked at his hands in the dim cabin light with the expression of someone reviewing evidence they already know the conclusions of. The tremor was present even at rest now, a fine and continuous reminder of what had been lost and what had not been recovered despite everything he had attempted. The other passengers slept or watched films or moved through their own private preoccupations, entirely unaware that the man in the window seat was travelling towards something that his rational mind continued to classify as implausible, driven by a desperation he was still not fully prepared to name. Kathmandu arrived beneath the plane as a density of light and structure set against the darkness of the surrounding landscape, and then as noise and colour and movement as he made his way through the airport and into the city beyond it. The air was different from New York's air in ways that were immediately and physically apparent, carrying the particular layering of smells and temperatures and particulate matter that belongs to a place with a completely different relationship to the atmosphere than any city he had previously inhabited. The streets through which his taxi moved were dense with a kind of human activity that operated according to principles he could not immediately organise into familiar patterns, where the boundaries between commerce and residence and religious practice and transportation existed in a different relationship to each other than he was accustomed to, where the sense of being in a place that had been continuously inhabited for a very long time produced a quality of historical density that New York, for all its intensity, had never quite offered. He had a name. He had an address of a kind, a description of a location in the older part of the city that the person who had given him the information had assured him was sufficient to find what he was looking for. Both of these pieces of information proved, in practice, considerably less useful than they had appeared in the planning stage of his journey. The name was not recognised by the first several people he asked, which he attempted to attribute to language barriers and pronunciation difficulties, rather than to the possibility that the name was simply unknown in the city he had travelled across the world to reach. The address description led him through streets that narrowed and turned in ways that made systematic navigation difficult, through a part of the city where the buildings pressed close, and the light between them fell at angles that made distances hard to judge. He was not someone who asked for help easily under ordinary circumstances. He was considerably less able to do so under these circumstances, in this place, where the asking required him to stand in the middle of unfamiliar streets and present himself as lost, which was a condition his identity had very little space for. He managed it, eventually, through the particular combination of stubbornness and resignation that sufficient desperation produces, approaching people with the name and the approximate description, and accepting the directions he received with a gratitude that he tried to make less stiff than his instincts wanted it to be. Most of the directions proved only partially accurate. Several contradicted each other. He walked for longer than he had expected, in the particular way that someone walks when they are following directions they are not entirely certain they understood correctly, with the alert and slightly effortful attention of someone who is trying to recognise a destination they have never seen. What eventually found him, or what he eventually found, the distinction felt genuinely uncertain afterward, was a man who appeared at the entrance to a narrow passage between buildings and regarded him with the calm, assessing attention of someone who has been expecting an arrival and is confirming that the right person has arrived. The man's name was Mordo, though Stephen did not know this yet. He was tall and composed and possessed of a stillness that Stephen Strange, who had spent his career in environments defined by controlled urgency, found immediately and inexplicably striking. Not the stillness of someone waiting, but the stillness of someone who has settled into the present moment with a completeness that most people never achieve. He looked at Stephen with the clear, direct attention of someone who sees more than he comments on, and said only that he had been expecting someone to come, and that Stephen should follow him. The passage led to a courtyard, and the courtyard to a door, and the door to an interior that was quiet and warm and arranged with the deliberate simplicity of a place where simplicity is itself a kind of statement. Stephen took in the details with the automatic cataloguing attention that had always been part of how he processed new environments. Noting the books arranged on shelves that lined an entire wall, the the quality of the light coming through windows that looked onto a small garden, the absence of the decorative excess that might have been expected in a place presenting itself as the source of miraculous outcomes. Nothing about the physical environment matched the category his skepticism had been preparing to engage with. It looked, more than anything else, like a place where serious people did serious work, which was a category his mind had considerable respect for, even in circumstances as disorienting as these. The Ancient One was already present in the room when he entered it, seated with the same quality of settled stillness that characterized Mordo, though in her case the stillness carried an additional quality that was more difficult to name, something that had to do with duration. With the impression of someone who had been still for much longer than any ordinary lifetime allows. She was not what his imagination had constructed during the journey, which had defaulted, despite his best efforts at rational suppression, toward the familiar imagery of mystical figures that popular culture provides. She was instead simply a person, clearly and specifically a person, who looked at him with attention so complete and so unhurried that it produced a quality of discomfort entirely different from any he had previously experienced. He presented his case with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making arguments that need to be persuasive. The medical history, the accident, the extent of the damage, the treatments pursued and their outcomes, the accounts that had eventually led him here. He was aware as he spoke that he was performing a version of confidence he did not entirely feel, deploying the manner of professional authority in a context where that manner had no particular standing. The Ancient One listened without interruption, with the kind of attention that does not require the management of a listener who might otherwise lose interest, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment in the way of someone allowing what has been said to settle, before responding to it. What she said was not what he expected. She did not address his medical history or the specifics of his injury or the claims about miraculous healing that had drawn him across the world. She addressed instead him, the particular quality of what she saw when she looked at him, the structure of the arrogance that was visible to her as clearly as his trembling hands were visible to anyone. She told him, with a directness that his own manner had never quite achieved, that he was a man who had come to her to receive something, who had spent his entire journey calculating what he deserved and what he would accept, and that this orientation was itself the primary obstacle he faced. Not the damage to his hands, not the limitations of his previous treatments, but the fundamental posture of someone who approaches the world as a transaction to be managed rather than a mystery to be entered. He rejected this characterization with the reflexive precision of someone who has heard a diagnosis they disagree with and is marshalling the counter-arguments. He told her that he was a man of science, that he dealt in what could be demonstrated and measured and replicated, that the framework she was gesturing toward was one he had no basis for accepting and considerable basis for rejecting. He told her this with the particular intensity of someone arguing against something they sense is true, which is always a more heated argument than the one mounted against something that feels entirely false. She did not argue with him. She considered him for a moment with the expression of someone who has had this conversation many times, and who knows where it ends, and then she did something that his subsequent years in the mystic arts never entirely allowed him to fully account for. She reached past the boundaries of his materialist framework and demonstrated directly and without theatrical preparation that the boundaries he had placed around the possible were simply too small for the reality they were trying to contain. What he experienced in that moment, the sudden expansion of his perception beyond every limit his previous understanding of consciousness had established. The vertiginous and overwhelming sensation of a universe vastly larger and stranger, and more layered than anything his training had equipped him to imagine, was not something his existing language had categories for. It was the first genuinely new experience of a life that had until that moment been organized entirely around the confirmation of what he already believed. He returned to ordinary awareness shaken in the specific way of someone whose foundational assumptions have been removed without warning, with the particular quality of disorientation that belongs not to confusion, but to the discovery that the map one has been using does not correspond to the territory. The Ancient One watched him process this with the patience of someone who has seen the same arrival many times, and who knows that the processing takes as long as it takes, and cannot be hurried by external intervention. And then she told him she would not teach him. She told him this calmly and without apology, as a simple statement of her assessment of his readiness, which was her prerogative to make, and which she had made. She told him that what she offered required a quality of openness that he had not yet demonstrated and might not be capable of demonstrating, that the intelligence which was so evident in him was at this particular moment an obstacle rather than an asset, that knowing a great deal about a great many things had left him very little room for the kind of genuine not knowing that learning at this level required. She said these things with a kindness that made them more difficult to dismiss than they might have been if delivered with judgment, and she suggested that he find his way back to the airport, which was, under the circumstances, the most clarifying and most motivating thing she could possibly have said to him. He did not go to the airport. He sat in the courtyard outside the door through which he had entered, and he allowed himself, for perhaps the first time since the accident, to simply be in a situation without attempting to manage his way out of it. The evening came while he sat there, and the sounds of the city moved through the air around him, and the particular quality of not knowing that the Ancient One had identified as the necessary starting point settled over him, with the gradual completeness of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment of exhaustion and surrender to make itself available. Mordo found him there after some time had passed and looked at him with the considering expression of someone revising an initial assessment, and said that perhaps he should come inside. And Stephen Strange, who had spent the better part of a year refusing every offer of help that had been extended to him, said yes. The inside that Mordo led him into that evening was quieter than the courtyard, and the courtyard had already been considerably quieter than the streets beyond it. And this layering of quietude, each threshold crossed producing a further settling of the noise that the world outside generated continuously, was itself a kind of introduction to the place and to its governing principles. Kamar-Taj, as Stephen would come to understand it over the weeks and months that followed, was organised around a quality of intentional stillness that was not the absence of activity but rather its opposite, a stillness that was the product of complete and conscious presence, of people who had learned to inhabit each moment with a fullness that left no remainder of attention available for the ambient noise that most people carry through their lives without noticing it is there. He was given a room that was simple in the way that rooms are simple when simplicity has been chosen, rather than merely defaulted to. A bed, a small table, a window that looked onto the garden he'd glimpsed earlier. Shelves that were empty and waiting. The emptiness of the shelves struck him with a particularity that he would only understand later, when he had spent enough time in Kamar-Taj to recognise that the empty shelf is a specific and deliberate statement in a place devoted to learning. An acknowledgement that the student arrives with less than they think they possess, and that the making of space is the first and most difficult work. He slept that night with the quality of sleep that follows extreme exhaustion, the kind that does not permit the restless processing of anxiety that had characterised most of his nights since the accident, and woke to morning light coming through the garden window and the distant sounds of the other students beginning their day. The existence of other students was something he had not quite registered during the previous evening's disorientation, and the awareness of them now, the sounds of their movement and their voices in the courtyard below, produced a complex response in him that mixed relief at not being entirely alone in this unfamiliar place, with the particular discomfort of someone who has always preferred to be distinguished from the group rather than part of it. The Ancient One came to him that morning without ceremony, arriving in the doorway of his room with the unhurried quality that seemed to characterize all of her movement, as though she had arranged her relationship with time in a way that made urgency simply unnecessary. She regarded him for a moment with the same complete attention she had offered the previous evening, and then she said that since he had chosen to remain, they would begin, and that beginning meant something different here than it had meant in any context he had previously inhabited. She said this without elaboration, and left him to follow her, which he did. The room she led him to was larger than his own, lined on all sides with the books he'd glimpsed briefly the evening before, their spines carrying titles in languages he recognised, and languages he did not, organised according to a system of arrangement that was not immediately apparent but that he sensed, even in his first encounter with it, had an internal logic that would reveal itself in time. Standing at the centre of this room was a man he had not yet met, who introduced himself simply as Wong, with the brevity of someone who considers names to be sufficient introduction, and finds additional elaboration unnecessary. Wong was the guardian of the library, the keeper of the texts that represented the accumulated knowledge of the mystic arts across centuries of study and practice, and he regarded the new arrival with an expression that was not unfriendly, but that reserved judgment in the specific way of someone who has encountered many people who believe themselves exceptional and has learned to wait for evidence before conceding the point. The library itself was the first thing in Kamar-Taj that Stephen Strange responded to without the interference of his skepticism or his pride. The response was simply immediate and genuine and consistent with the person he had always been beneath the professional manner and the cultivated arrogance. He had always loved books with the specific love of someone for whom reading is not a pastime but a primary mode of engaging with the world, and the library of Kamar-Taj was unlike any collection he had previously encountered, not merely in the nature of its contents, but in the quality of its organization and the sense it communicated of being a living thing rather than an archive, a place where knowledge was actively consulted and debated and built upon rather than simply stored. He felt, standing in the library for the first time, the faint and tentative stirring of something that his months of despair had suppressed so thoroughly that he had begun to wonder if it was gone. The appetite for understanding that had been the original engine of his exceptional mind, before it had been narrowed and directed entirely into the channels of surgical achievement. Wong noted his response to the library with the quiet attention he brought to everything, and said nothing about it, which was precisely the right response and which Stephen only gradually came to appreciate. The first formal lesson with the Ancient One took place in the main courtyard the following morning, with several other students present, and it was here that the first serious dismantling of Stephen Strange's worldview occurred. He had arrived prepared, in the way that he always arrived at new intellectual territory, having spent the previous evening in the library reading everything he could access that seemed relevant to what he was being asked to accept, building for himself a preliminary framework within which the unfamiliar material might be organized and evaluated. This preparation was genuine and thorough and entirely beside the point, which the Ancient One demonstrated to him with a directness that was not cruel but that was completely without softening. She asked him, in front of the other students, to open a portal. She demonstrated the gesture required, the specific movement of the hands that draws the sling ring's energy into a stable aperture between one location and another, and she explained its underlying principles with the clarity and precision of someone who has taught the same thing many times and has refined the explanation to its essential form. She then asked him to do it himself. He could not. This was not surprising. It was his first attempt, and the other students who made it look relatively effortless had been practicing for months or years. But the manner of his failure was instructive in a way that the failure itself was not. He approached the gesture with the analytical precision that had always served him in surgical practice, breaking the movement into its component parts, identifying the mechanical relationships between one element and the next, attempting to execute the gesture as a sequence of correctly performed steps. Nothing happened. He refined his analysis and tried again. Nothing happened. He identified what he believed to be specific technical errors in his execution and corrected them. Nothing continued to happen. The Ancient One watched all of this without expression, and then she said something that cracked the foundation of his approach more completely than any criticism of his technique could have done. She told him that he was the problem, not his hands, not his analysis, not the specific execution of the gesture. Him. The entirety of his orientation toward the task, his insistence on approaching it as a problem to be broken down and solved through intellectual analysis, was itself the barrier he was facing. The mystic arts, she explained, do not respond to the mind that stands apart from experience and manages it from a distance. They respond to the mind that enters experience completely, that surrenders the controlling position and allows itself to be transformed by what it encounters, rather than merely processing it from the outside. This was not, for Stephen Strange, a small thing to hear. The controlling position, the stance of the mind that stands apart and manages and analyzes, was not simply a professional habit or an intellectual preference. It was the organizing principle of his entire identity, the posture he had inhabited so continuously and so completely that he had ceased to experience it as a posture at all and had come to experience it simply as himself. To be told that this was the problem was to be told that he was the problem, which was a statement that his pride would normally have rejected without consideration, and which he found, in this particular moment, impossible to reject in the way he was accustomed to rejecting things, because the evidence of the previous day's experience was still present in him, the memory of what it had felt like to have his framework removed, and the memory did not support the conclusion that his framework was sufficient. He did not open a portal that day. He did not open one for several days following that first lesson, and the period of failure was both longer and more instructive than any period of failure he had previously endured, because it could not be addressed through the methods he had always relied upon. More analysis did not help. More practice in the mechanical sense did not help. Harder effort did not help. The failure was not the kind that yields to persistence applied in the usual ways, and recognizing this, truly recognizing it, not simply acknowledging it intellectually but feeling it in the specific way that the body registers truth that the mind is slow to accept, was the beginning of the learning that Kamar-Taj was actually offering him. Mordo was present through much of this early period, in the role of guide and companion that the Ancient One had evidently assigned him, and his presence proved to be one of the more valuable aspects of Stephen's introduction to his new world. Mordo was someone who had come to the mystic arts through his own experience of loss and transformation, who had built within himself a relationship to discipline and practice that was rigorous and completely sincere, and who possessed the particular quality of patience available to someone who has genuinely worked through something difficult, and therefore has no need to perform either ease or struggle. He explained things when explanation was useful, and was quiet when it was not, and he treated Stephen not as a skeptic to be converted, or a problem to be managed, but simply as someone at an earlier stage of a journey that Mordo had made himself and remembered clearly enough to be useful company on. Their conversations in the evenings, in the courtyard or in the library, ranged across the principles underlying what they were being taught, with a depth and seriousness that Stephen found genuinely engaging in a way that surprised him. He had expected, if he was honest, to find the intellectual dimension of Kamar-Taj disappointing, to discover that the framework he was being asked to enter was thin or poorly considered or dependent on the suspension of exactly the kind of rigorous thinking he had always valued. He found instead that the tradition he was being introduced to was one of extraordinary richness and internal coherence, that the questions it engaged with were questions his scientific training had simply declined to address rather than questions it had answered, that the accumulated thinking of the practitioners who had contributed to this library across many centuries represented a body of serious inquiry that demanded serious engagement. Wong observed this dawning engagement with the library's contents with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, and began, without announcement or explanation, to make specific texts available to Stephen, leaving volumes on the table in his room, drawing his attention to particular passages during the hours he spent in the library, creating a reading path through the collection that was clearly curated and clearly purposeful without ever being explicitly described as such. This was Wong's particular form of teaching, and it was one that suited Stephen's intellectual character perhaps better than any more direct instruction could have. It trusted his intelligence while directing it, allowing him the experience of discovery while ensuring that the discoveries moved in productive directions. The Ancient One's relationship to her new student during this early period was characterized by the same quality that had marked their first encounter, a completeness of attention combined with an absence of the reassurance that attention is sometimes deployed to provide. She saw him clearly and consistently, and did not soften what she saw with the kind of encouragement that would have felt to someone of his intelligence more like condescension than support. What she offered instead was something more valuable and more difficult to receive, the experience of being genuinely known by someone whose judgment he was, despite himself, beginning to respect. She knew the shape of his arrogance and the depth of his intelligence, and the specific nature of the loss he was carrying, and she treated all of these things as the raw materials of someone who had not yet become what they were capable of being, which was a more generous and more demanding response to his situation than anything he had previously encountered. He was, by the end of his first weeks at Kamar-Taj, still nowhere near opening a portal. He was still failing at the foundational exercises with a consistency that would have been humiliating in any context he had previously inhabited. But something had shifted in the quality of the failure. It had become, almost without his noticing when the change occurred, interesting rather than simply frustrating, a genuine puzzle rather than an obstacle to be overcome through force. The mind that had spent the better part of a year turning away from anything that might require it to admit its own limitations was beginning, tentatively and without fanfare, to turn toward what it did not yet understand. It was a small turning, and it was slow, and it was accompanied by all the discomfort that genuine change in a deeply established pattern always produces. But it was real, and the Ancient One who noticed everything noted it with the particular quality of satisfaction available to a teacher who has recognized, in someone who arrived as difficult raw material, the first evidence that the work is genuinely beginning. The turning that had begun in those first weeks at Kamar-Taj did not accelerate in the way that Stephen Strange's previous experience of learning had led him to expect. In every other domain he had mastered, the initial period of difficulty had given way, once the foundational principles were genuinely understood, to a gathering momentum, a quickening of progress that rewarded the investment of effort and intelligence with increasingly rapid returns. He had assumed, without quite examining the assumption, that the mystic arts would eventually follow this same pattern, that the frustrating early weeks of failure would resolve into a more familiar rhythm of improvement and accumulation. What he discovered instead was that the learning available at Kamar-Taj did not move in the direction of momentum, but in the direction of depth, that each thing genuinely understood opened not into greater speed, but into greater stillness. And that this was precisely the point. The morning practices became the organizing structure of his days, replacing the absence of structure that had characterized his months of withdrawal in New York, with a rhythm that was demanding without being urgent, that asked something of him continuously, without ever asking it in a way that felt like pressure. He rose before the light changed in his garden window, and joined the other students in the main courtyard, where the practice of moving through the foundational forms of the mystic arts in the cool morning air produced a quality of physical and mental engagement that his previous life had never quite offered. Surgery had required extraordinary physical precision, but it had been the precision of stillness, of controlled immobility in the service of delicate intervention. What the morning practice asked of him was something different, a precision of movement, of the whole body moving through space with conscious attention to the relationship between physical gesture and interior intention. He was not good at this in the beginning, which was a fact he had to encounter repeatedly, and without the protection of any available excuse. The other students whose forms were more refined than his had simply been practicing longer, and the gap between his current ability and theirs was a direct and unambiguous measure of how much he had yet to learn. This was a kind of transparency that his previous professional context had never required of him. In surgical practice, the hierarchy of skill had always operated in his favour, the distance between his abilities and those of his peers running in the direction of his superiority rather than his deficiency. To exist daily in the opposite position, to be the least capable person in a room rather than the most, was a continuing lesson that no amount of intellectual acceptance could substitute for the lived experience of simply enduring. What helped was Wong, not through anything so direct as encouragement or instruction, but through the quality of his company during the hours that Stephen spent in the library, which were the hours that felt most natural and most generative from the beginning. Wong moved through the library with the unhurried authority of someone who has spent a long time in genuine relationship with the texts he tends, who knows not just where each volume is located, but what it contains and how it speaks to the volumes around it, who understands the collection as a whole rather than as an accumulation of individual items. He did not explain this relationship. He simply inhabited it. And the inhabiting was itself a form of instruction, a demonstration that knowledge of the kind stored in these shelves was not something to be extracted and applied, but something to be lived with over time, deepened through continuous return and genuine attention. The texts that Wong directed Stephen toward during this period ranged more widely than he had expected, extending beyond the technical literature of the mystic arts into philosophical traditions that provided the conceptual framework within which those arts had developed and been understood. He read accounts of practitioners whose work spanned centuries, who had engaged with questions about the nature of consciousness and reality, and time that his scientific training had taught him to regard as outside the domain of serious inquiry. And he found in these accounts a quality of rigour and intellectual honesty that he had not anticipated. The best of these thinkers had not asked him to abandon the standards of careful reasoning that his education had instilled. They had asked him to apply those standards to a larger set of phenomena than his previous framework had been willing to admit. The question of the hands came up, inevitably and repeatedly, in the context of his practice, because the sling ring required precise gestural control, and because precise gestural control was exactly what the accident had compromised, and because the relationship between what his hands could now do and what the exercises required was a daily confrontation with the specific nature of his loss. He raised this with the Ancient One during one of their individual sessions, framing it as a practical problem, an obstacle to his technical development that needed to be acknowledged and addressed. She listened to him lay out the argument with the patience she always brought to his arguments, and then she told him something that reframed the obstacle so completely that it took him several days to fully understand what she had said. She told him that his hands were not the instrument of the mystic arts. His hands were the instrument of his former life, and his attachment to them as the primary measure of his capability was itself a form of the same arrogance that had been obstructing him since his arrival. The insistence that what he had been able to do before the accident was the relevant standard against which his current development should be measured. The mystic arts, she said, do not flow through the hands. They flow through the whole self, through the entirety of what a practitioner brings to the practice, their attention, their intention, their willingness to be a conduit for forces that exceed their individual capacity to generate or control. The hands are involved, yes, as all physical gesture is involved, but they are not the source, and treating them as the source was a misunderstanding of what he was actually learning to do. He sat with this for a long time, in the way that he was slowly learning to sit with things rather than immediately reaching for a response or a counter-argument. And what he found in the sitting was that she was right in a way that went beyond the specific context of the mystic arts, that his entire relationship to his hands since the accident had been organized around the assumption that they were the essential thing, that their damage was the primary loss, when what had actually been damaged was something more interior and more difficult to name, something that the hands had merely expressed rather than embodied. The hands had been the visible instrument of his identity, but the identity itself was something that the accident had not touched, and that the months of despair had obscured but not destroyed, and that was available to him still, waiting to be redirected. The first morning that he managed to hold a portal open for more than a few seconds was not marked by any particular ceremony or external acknowledgement. It happened during a practice session in the middle of a week that had otherwise been unremarkable, and the portal was small and unstable, and lasted for a duration that would have been entirely insufficient for any practical purpose. But it lasted, and in the moment of its lasting, there was something that Stephen Strange had not felt for a very long time. The specific quality of rightness that accompanies the first successful execution of something genuinely difficult. The confirmation that the capacity is present and that the work has been moving in the correct direction. He closed the portal and stood quietly in the courtyard, and allowed himself simply to register the experience without immediately moving on to the next thing, which was itself a small but real evidence of the change that Kamar-Taj was producing in him. Mordo, who had been practicing nearby, met his eyes briefly and offered a nod that carried more warmth than its brevity suggested, and then returned to his own practice without making anything more of the moment. This too was instructive. The recognition without inflation, the acknowledgement without ceremony, the assumption that progress is to be noted and then continued rather than celebrated and thereby interrupted. The weeks that followed the first portal produced a gradual and uneven expansion of his capability, with the unevenness being as instructive as the expansion. There were days when things that had seemed to become reliable suddenly failed again, when the interior alignment that the practice required was simply not available, when some undissolved residue of his old habits of mind reasserted itself and produced the familiar blankness of effort without result. He had expected, based on his previous experience of mastery, that progress would be essentially linear, that each thing learned would be securely added to the foundation, and that the foundation would only grow. What he discovered was that the learning available here was not additive in that way, that it required continuous tending rather than simple accumulation, that the things he was developing were less like skills to be acquired and more like capacities to be maintained through ongoing practice and honest attention. The relationship between his intellectual engagement with the library and his practical development in the courtyard turned out to be more directly connected than he had initially understood. The texts that Wong was curating for him were not simply background context for the practical work. They were part of the practical work, engaged with in a particular way. The specific kind of reading that the library invited was itself a practice of the quality of attention that the mystic arts required, a training of the mind in the habit of genuine receptivity rather than the extraction of usable information. He began to notice that his most productive sessions in the courtyard tended to follow periods of reading that had produced in him a particular quality of absorbed stillness, a state in which the analytical monitoring of his own thinking had temporarily quieted, and something less effortful and more direct had been able to operate. Wang noted this connection without making it explicit, in the way that he noted most things, through the specific texts he made available, through the hours at which he left things on the table in Stephen's room, through the subtle adjustments he made to the reading path as Stephen's engagement with the material deepened and became more genuinely reciprocal. Their relationship during this period was not conventionally friendly. Wang's affect remained consistent and relatively unexpansive, his humour dry to the point of requiring careful attention to detect it at all, his engagement with Stephen professional in a way that kept its warmth well contained. But the care that organised his attention to Stephen's development was as genuine and as continuous as any warmer expression of it might have been, and Stephen, who had spent his career surrounded by people who performed care for social reasons, found the unperfumed version unexpectedly sustaining. The Ancient One's individual sessions with him during this period moved progressively further from the technical dimensions of his practice and deeper into territory that his previous framework had no category for. She spoke with him about the nature of time, not as a theoretical matter, but as a lived one, about the specific experience of inhabiting the present moment with the completeness that the mystic arts both required and produced, and what this experience had to teach about the relationship between consciousness and the reality it perceives. She spoke about the multiverse not as an abstract cosmological claim, but as a perceptual fact, something that the practitioner of the mystic arts comes to experience directly, rather than simply to know intellectually, and the difference between knowing it and experiencing it, she suggested, was roughly the difference between reading about the ocean and swimming in it. He asked her during one of these sessions about her own experience of this, how long she had been practicing, what the accumulated years of engagement with the mystic arts had produced in her understanding of the world and her place in it. She answered some of his questions and deflected others with the ease of someone who has long practice at being genuinely forthcoming about certain things while maintaining appropriate silence about others. What she gave him was sufficient to understand that her relationship to time and experience was organised differently from anything he had previously encountered, that the duration of her engagement with the work she did had produced a perspective on human experience and human possibility that was simply not available from inside a single ordinary lifetime. He did not yet know about the dark dimension, about the specific bargain that sustained her longevity, about the hypocrisy that Mordo would eventually find unforgivable, and that the Ancient One herself carried with a weight that only her oldest students had ever had occasion to perceive. These things were not available to him yet. What was available was the experience of her attention, consistently offered and consistently illuminating, and the gradual, accumulating sense that he was in the presence of someone who had looked at existence from a vantage point that very few people ever reach, and who was, for reasons of her own, investing in the possibility that he might eventually reach something like it himself. By the time several months had passed since his arrival in Kathmandu, Stephen Strange had not become a different person. He had not shed the intelligence or the ambition or even entirely the arrogance that had always characterized him. But these qualities were operating differently than they had before, within a larger container and in relationship to a more honest understanding of their limits and their proper function. The man who had arrived at Kamar-Taj as a last resort, driven by desperation and sustained by pride, was beginning, slowly and without drama, to arrive at something else, a practice, a community, and the early outlines of a purpose that was larger than anything his previous life had offered him, and that he was only beginning to understand how much he needed. The container that Kamar-Taj had been building in Stephen Strange across those months of practice and study proved, as his engagement with the deeper dimensions of the mystic arts began, to be both larger and more necessary than he had understood while it was being constructed. The foundational work, the morning forms, the portal practice, the long hours in the library moving through texts that had gradually shifted from unfamiliar to inhabited, had been preparing him for territory that his previous framework not only lacked the tools to navigate, but had lacked even the conceptual vocabulary to describe. What he encountered as his training deepened was not simply a new body of knowledge to be added to what he already possessed. It was a new relationship to knowledge itself, a new understanding of what knowing means when the thing being known exceeds the capacity of the ordinary mind to contain it. The mirror dimension was among the first of these deeper territories to become available to him, and his initial encounter with it produced the specific quality of disorientation that belongs to experiences that are entirely outside one's existing categories, not frightening in the conventional sense, not threatening to the body or the immediate sense of self, but deeply and persistently strange in the way that genuine encounters with the genuinely new always are. The mirror dimension is a reflected version of the physical world, sharing its geography and its visual character while operating according to different rules, a space where the apparent solidity of matter becomes something more like a suggestion, where the surfaces and structures of ordinary reality can be folded and rearranged and moved through in ways that the physical world does not permit. To step into it for the first time is to understand, in a way that no description quite prepares one for, that what had always seemed to be the fixed and necessary character of physical reality was actually a particular arrangement of something far more fluid. He spent time in the mirror dimension under the Ancient One's supervision during this period, learning first simply to inhabit it, to move through its reflected geography with the quality of calm attention that the environment required, without the reflexive attempt to reassert the categories of ordinary experience that the mind reaches for whenever its usual framework is destabilized. The learning here was less about technique than about tolerance, about the development of a capacity to remain present and functional in conditions that produced a continuous low-level pressure on every assumption he had carried about the nature of space and structure and the relationship between consciousness and its environment. What the mirror dimension taught him, over many sessions of practice, was something that the library had been moving him toward intellectually, but that could only be genuinely understood through direct experience. That the world perceived by ordinary consciousness is not the world in its fullness, but a particular slice of it, selected and organized by the specific apparatus of human perception, operating within the specific constraints of physical embodiment. The mystic arts did not create a different world. They expanded the range of the world that was accessible, drew back the boundary of what could be perceived and engaged with and influenced, invited the practitioner into a relationship with reality that was simply larger than the one available to unaugmented human experience. The astral plane arrived as a different kind of revelation, more intimate and in some ways more disturbing than the mirror dimension, because what it made available was not a different relationship to external reality, but a different relationship to the self. Astral projection, the capacity to exist outside the physical body, to perceive and move and act from a position unconstrained by the body's location or condition, was something that Stephen encountered first in the library's texts, described by practitioners across many centuries with a consistency of detail that his scientific skepticism had initially dismissed as the contamination of one account by another. The actual experience of it, when it became available to him during a practice session with the Ancient One present, made the literary accounts feel like pale approximations of something that language struggles to contain. The experience of leaving the body is not, as the texts had suggested, and as he had intellectually prepared himself to understand, an experience of loss. It is an experience of expansion. The consciousness that steps free of its physical housing discovers not that it has been diminished by the separation, but that it has been, in some specific and important sense, enlarged, released from the particular constraints of the body's location and perspective, able to perceive from a position that is not anchored to a single point in space. He looked at his own body from outside it for the first time, and found the experience neither frightening nor alienating, but simply very quiet, the way that seeing a familiar place from an unfamiliar angle produces not disorientation, but a sudden clarity about aspects of the familiar that had previously been invisible. The implications of astral projection for his understanding of consciousness were ones he returned to repeatedly in his reading and in his conversations with the Ancient One, because they pressed directly against the materialist framework that had organized his entire previous understanding of what a person is. If consciousness can exist and operate independently of the physical brain, if the experience of awareness and perception and intention can continue in the absence of the biological structures that his training had always treated as their necessary substrate, then the relationship between mind and matter is something more complex and more mysterious than the model he had inherited from his scientific education. He did not resolve this tension into a new, settled position. He held it, in the way that he was learning to hold things whose resolution was not yet available, and allowed the holding to change him gradually rather than reaching for a conclusion that would have foreclosed the continued movement of his understanding. The Eye of Agamotto came to his attention through the library initially. In texts that described it with a reverence and a careful circumspection that communicated the significance of the object before any of its specific properties were articulated. It was a relic of extraordinary power, one of the most significant artifacts in the mystic arts tradition, housed in the New York sanctum and brought to Kamar-Taj for his examination during a period when his understanding of temporal mechanics had developed sufficiently to make the encounter useful rather than merely overwhelming. Its connection to the Time Stone, one of the 6 infinity stones whose existence the text described as foundational to the architecture of reality itself, was something the Ancient One explained to him with the care that significant information always received from her, ensuring that what he understood was accurate and complete, rather than partial in ways that might produce misunderstanding. The Time Stone's nature, as he came to understand it through his reading and through his directive careful engagement with the Eye of Agamotto, was unlike anything in his previous experience of powerful things. Its relationship to time was not mechanical, in the way that the instruments of his surgical career had been mechanical, tools that did what was asked of them within the constraints of their design. The stone existed in a different relationship to causality than ordinary objects, capable of influencing the flow of time in ways that the text described with great precision and great caution, because the possibilities it opened were matched by consequences of equivalent magnitude. To change the past is to alter the present. To alter the present is to reshape everything that follows. The responsibility attached to the capacity was not simply proportional to the capacity. It was of a different order entirely, requiring a quality of wisdom and restraint that the Ancient One communicated clearly was not something she regarded as yet fully present in her newest student. He accepted this assessment without the reflexive argument that would have been his response in earlier months, which was itself a measure of how much he had changed. The man who had arrived at Kamar-Taj insisting on his own comprehensive competence had become, through the slow and continuous work of genuine practice, someone capable of hearing that he was not yet ready for something, without experiencing the information as an attack on his fundamental worth. This was not humility in the performative sense, not the affected modesty of someone who has decided that appearing humble is strategically useful. It was something quieter and more durable, the authentic recognition that genuine capability takes time to develop, and that the time is not wasted. The multiverse, which the text had been gesturing towards since his earliest days in the library, became during this period of deeper study something that shifted from theoretical framework to perceptual reality, a shift that occurred not in a single dramatic revelation, but through the gradual accumulation of experiences that could not be adequately accounted for within a model of singular linear reality. He encountered evidence of the multiverse through his expanding perception in the ways that the mystic arts make available, through the mirror dimension suggestion of realities adjacent to the physical world, through the astral plane's demonstration that consciousness is not bound to a single location, through texts that described with specific and consistent detail the existence of infinite parallel realities, each one a variation on the possibilities that any given moment contains, branching from every decision and every accident and every convergence of forces into separate streams of continued existence. The philosophical implications of this understanding occupied him considerably during this period, drawing on dimensions of his thinking that surgery had never particularly engaged, the questions about identity and choice, and the nature of the self that infinite parallel existence raises, the question of what it means to make a decision when every possible decision is being made in some version of reality, the question of whether the existence of infinite alternatives diminishes or amplifies the significance of the choices made in any particular one. He discussed these questions with Mordo, who engaged with them from a perspective shaped by his own long study, and by a philosophical orientation that was more certain in its conclusions than Stephen's. Mordo believed firmly in the laws of nature as the necessary framework within which the mystic arts must operate, in the obligation to work within constraints rather than circumvent them, and this belief gave his engagement with the multiverse a particular quality of serious moral weight that Stephen found genuinely valuable as a counterbalance to his own tendency towards speculative openness. Their conversations during the evenings, which had become one of the consistent pleasures of Stephen's life at Kamar-Taj, ranged across these questions with the specific warmth of intellectual exchange between people who are genuinely different in their orientations and who have developed enough trust to allow the differences to be productive rather than simply divisive. Mordo's certainty pushed against Stephen's flexibility. Stephen's willingness to follow a question wherever it led pushed against Mordo's commitment to established boundaries. The friction between these orientations produced, in their conversations, something better than either position alone, a more complete engagement with the material than either of them would have achieved independently. Wong participated in these conversations occasionally, when the topic moved into territory that the library's contents illuminated in specific ways he could contribute, offering references and clarifications with the characteristic economy of someone who speaks precisely because every word is chosen. His knowledge of the tradition's breadth was comprehensive in a way that neither Stephen nor Mordo could yet match, and he deployed it without ostentation, making it available as a resource rather than displaying it as an achievement. Stephen's growing respect for Wong during this period was the specific kind of respect available to a genuinely intelligent person who has encountered another intelligent person operating in a mode entirely different from their own. The recognition of an excellence that one could not have predicted or appreciated before encountering it. The protective sanctums in New York, in London, in Hong Kong came into his understanding during this period through the Ancient One's explanation of the system by which Earth was defended against incursion from dimensions and entities whose relationship to the physical world was one of predation rather than coexistence. The sanctums maintained the shields that prevented the boundaries of ordinary reality from being penetrated by forces that operated according to different laws and different values, and the practitioners who served as their guardians were the last line of defense against threats that most of humanity would never know existed, and was therefore never positioned to face. Understanding the sanctum system clarified for Stephen, in a way that the more theoretical dimensions of his study had not quite accomplished, the specific nature and the specific urgency of the work that the practitioners of the mystic arts were engaged in, not the abstract cultivation of personal capability, but the concrete, continuous, largely invisible labour of keeping the world safe from what lay beyond its boundaries. He sat with this understanding in the library one evening after the other. Students had dispersed to their rooms, in the particular quality of late evening quiet that the library possessed when it was nearly empty, and the lamps had been reduced to a soft and steady glow. The books around him, which had been unfamiliar territory when he first entered this room, had become over many months something approaching what a home feels like, a place organised around the things he cared about most, populated by the accumulated thinking of people who had engaged seriously with questions that deserved serious engagement, tended by someone whose care for them was both practical and profound. He thought about the surgeon he had been and the practitioner he was becoming, and the distance between them, which had once felt like pure loss, had taken on a different quality, not loss replaced by gain, exactly, but something more like depth replacing surface, a self that was genuinely larger than the one that had preceded it, built from the materials of the preceding self's demolition. The thought arrived without drama and settled without resistance, in the particular manner of truths that have been approaching for a long time and that, when they finally arrive, feel less like revelations than like recognitions, the sense of knowing something that, in some way, one has always known, the understanding of what the sanctums protected against, which had settled into Stephen Strange with such quiet clarity during that evening in the library, was about to be tested by a threat that had been developing long before his arrival at Kamar-Taj, in the specific way that the most significant dangers tend to develop. Not suddenly, not announced by any clear signal that those responsible for protection might have intercepted and addressed, but gradually and from within, shaped by grief and disillusionment, and the particular vulnerability of someone who had given everything to a tradition, and had then encountered, in the tradition itself, something they could not forgive. Caecilius had been one of the Ancient One's most gifted students. This fact, which might be presented as ironic given what he eventually became, is better understood as simply true. The gifts that had made him exceptional in the service of the mystic arts were the same gifts that made him exceptionally dangerous when those arts were redirected toward a different purpose. Talent does not belong to the purposes it is initially directed toward. It goes where the person carrying it decides to go, and what decides the direction is never the talent itself, but the interior life of the person who possesses it, the particular constellation of experience and loss and belief that determines what a person is ultimately reaching for. His background, before Kamar-Taj, had been shaped by a specific and devastating grief, the loss of people he loved with a completeness and a suddenness that left him in the particular position of someone for whom the ordinary consolations of continued living have temporarily ceased to function. He had lost his wife and then his son, in circumstances that the passing of time did not soften in the way that time is supposed to soften such things, and the failure of time to perform its expected work of gradual healing had produced in him a bitterness directed not at any individual or circumstance, but at the fundamental structure of a reality that permits such losses to occur without remedy or redress. He came to the mystic arts from this place, from grief rather than curiosity, from desperation rather than intellectual appetite, seeking in the tradition's vast knowledge some answer to the question that his personal history had made urgent beyond all others. Why must the people we love be taken from us, and what, if anything, can be done about it? The Ancient One had seen in him both the genuine gifts and the specific wound that organized his seeking, and had taught him with the full generosity that her teaching always carried, trusting that the tradition's wisdom would provide him with the larger framework within which his grief might find perspective, rather than amplification. For a considerable time, this trust appeared to be justified. Caecilius applied himself to his training with an intensity and a dedication that distinguished him among his fellow students, developing capabilities that placed him among the most accomplished practitioners of his generation. He was serious in the way that people are serious when they believe that what they are doing genuinely matters, and the seriousness produced excellent work, and the excellent work produced the trust of the Ancient One and the respect of his peers. The fracture, when it came, arrived through the library, through access to texts that the Ancient One kept restricted, not because their contents were inherently corrupt, but because the readiness required to engage with them safely was something that had to be developed through a specific quality of practice and personal integration before the information could be received without distortion. Caecilius reached these texts before that readiness was fully developed, or perhaps developed it in ways that the grief at his foundation had already compromised, and what he found in them was not what a more settled student would have found, but something filtered through the specific lens of what he most desperately needed to believe. The text described Dormammu and the Dark Dimension with the careful and balanced attention that the tradition brought to all significant knowledge, acknowledging the dimension's extraordinary properties, its existence outside of time in a way that ordinary reality does not permit, its capacity to offer its inhabitants a form of existence that is not subject to the ordinary constraints of mortality and loss, while also being precise about the nature of that existence and the cost at which it was obtained. What Caecilius took from these texts, through the distorting lens of his grief and his need, was the promise rather than the warning, the possibility that within the dark dimension lay the answer to the loss that had broken him, the possibility that the people he had loved might still exist somewhere, or that existence might be extended in ways that would prevent such losses from occurring again. The pages he eventually stole from the Book of Cagliostro, ancient and powerful texts describing the specific ritual by which the dark dimension's influence could be drawn into the physical world, represented not a simple act of theft, but the conclusion of a long interior journey toward a position from which such an act had become not merely possible but inevitable. He had reasoned his way, through the specific machinery of grief-driven thinking, to a place where the theft was not only justified but required, where the tradition's restrictions were evidence of the Ancient One's own self-interest, rather than of genuine wisdom, where the protection of the world from the dark dimension's influence was reframed as the hoarding of a gift that all of humanity deserved to share. This reframing is worth dwelling on with the gentleness it deserves, because it is not the reasoning of a corrupt person, but the reasoning of a wounded one. The specific way that genuine pain, when it encounters a framework that appears to offer relief, can reorganize all available evidence to support the move toward that framework, dismissing the counter-evidence not through dishonesty, but through the motivated selectivity that grief and desperate hope together produce. Caecilius was not lying to himself or to the followers he eventually gathered. He believed, with the complete conviction available to someone who has organized their entire understanding of reality around a central need, that what he was doing was right. This does not make what he did less devastating in its consequences. It makes it, in a specific and important way, more so, because the tragedy of a person who does terrible things from genuine conviction is of a different order than the tragedy of simple malice. The followers he gathered around him in the period following his departure from Kamar-Taj were people who had recognized in his message something that resonated with their own experiences of loss and limitation. People who had encountered the boundaries of ordinary human existence and found those boundaries not simply difficult but genuinely unbearable. Who were drawn to the possibility that those boundaries could be transcended rather than simply endured. He offered them community and purpose, and the specific comfort of believing that what they were working toward was not their own benefit, but the liberation of all of humanity from the constraints of mortality. The ideological dimension of his movement was genuine and not merely instrumental. He truly believed in the universal application of what he was seeking, and the belief gave his followers something to serve that felt larger than any merely personal desire. The dark dimension itself, which lay at the center of his longing and his planning, exists in a relationship to ordinary reality that the tradition's texts describe with consistent and careful precision. It is a realm that has been consumed by Dormammu, an entity whose nature is not simply that of a powerful being but of something more fundamental, a force of expansion and consumption that has extended itself through dimensions the way that certain physical processes extend through matter, absorbing what it encounters and incorporating it into itself. The dimensions that Dormammu has consumed are not destroyed in the conventional sense. They persist within him, but they persist without the independent existence that makes experience meaningful, absorbed into his nature in a way that eliminates the boundaries between self and other that consciousness requires in order to function as consciousness. Dormammu's relationship to time deserves specific attention in any honest account of what Caecilius was seeking and what it actually offered. The dark dimension exists outside of time in the sense that the temporal structure of ordinary reality, the sequential progression of moments from past through present into future that organizes all human experience, does not apply within its boundaries. This absence of time is what Caecilius interpreted as the answer to mortality, as the solution to the problem of loss. But the absence of time within the dark dimension is not an experience of timeless peace or eternal presence. It is simply the absence of the structure within which experience and loss and love and all the other features of conscious existence occur. What Dormammu offered was not life without death. It was existence without the conditions that make either life or death meaningful. This distinction, which the Ancient One's texts had been careful to draw and which Caecilius had found ways to read past, is the specific gap between what he promised his followers and what he was actually moving them toward. A gap that genuine compassion for him requires acknowledging without allowing it to obscure the magnitude of what his choices set in motion. The attack on the sanctums, carried out with the precision and the power of a practitioner who had developed his abilities to an exceptional level before redirecting them, was designed to dismantle the protective barriers that prevented the dark dimension from expanding into the physical world. Each sanctum destroyed would weaken the overall shield that the system maintained, and the destruction of all three would open the physical world to Dormammu's influence in a way from which recovery would not be possible. The London sanctum fell first, in an attack that was swift and devastating and that demonstrated the scale of what the Ancient One and her remaining students were facing. The loss of the sanctum's protection was immediately felt in the broader system, a weakening of the shields that those sensitive to such things could perceive, with the particular quality of alarm that belongs to the recognition of a familiar thing becoming less itself. Word reached Kamar-Taj through channels that the tradition maintained for exactly such emergencies, and the response that the Ancient One organized carried the gravity of someone who had known this threat, was developing, and had been preparing for the moment of its full emergence with the combination of practical readiness and deep personal sorrow that the situation warranted. She had trained Caecilius. She had seen in him both the gifts and the wound, and she had made choices about how to engage with both that she had lived with for years, understanding that the choices had been made with the best available judgment, and that the outcome had nevertheless produced something she would have given a great deal to prevent. The specific sadness that the Ancient One carried into the conflict with her former student was not guilt. She had done what she believed was right, and she continued to believe it. But something quieter and more personal than guilt, the particular sorrow of someone who cares about a person they can no longer reach, who watches from a distance as someone they invested in moves further into territory where no intervention can follow. Stephen Strange received the news of the Sanctum attacks and the threat that Caecilius represented during a period in his training when his understanding of the tradition's broader responsibilities had only recently become clear. And the juxtaposition of that understanding with the concrete emergency it was suddenly required to address produced in him a quality of focused attention that was recognizably consistent with the surgeon he had been, the capacity to set aside everything extraneous when the situation required complete presence and clear thinking. He was not yet the practitioner he would become. He did not yet have the full range of capabilities that the situation would eventually demand of him. But the foundational work of his months at Kamar-Taj had built in him something that raw capability alone could not have provided, a quality of character capable of meeting what was coming with a specific combination of intelligence and humility, and genuine commitment to something larger than himself that the moment required. The threat that Caecilius represented was therefore not simply a crisis to be resolved, but a test of everything that the work at Kamar-Taj had been building toward in Stephen Strange. Specifically, and in the tradition of the mystic arts more broadly, the question it posed was not simply whether the sanctums could be defended, or the dark dimension's advance prevented, but whether the tradition had succeeded in its primary purpose of producing practitioners who understood what they were protecting and why, who had internalized the responsibility deeply enough to act on it, regardless of the personal cost. The answer to that question would be worked out not in the library or the courtyard, but in the full and consequential territory of events that were already in motion, moving toward a resolution that no amount of preparation could make entirely certain, and that the willingness to act without certainty is always, in the end, what genuine commitment requires. The events set in motion by Caecilius and his followers moved toward their resolution through a sequence of confrontations that tested Stephen Strange in ways his training had prepared him for in principle, and that direct experience now made immediate and unavoidable in practice. He found himself drawn into the conflict not through any deliberate assignment or formal commissioning, but through the particular logic of circumstances, the way that someone with the right capabilities present at the right moment gets pulled by events into a role that has not yet been formally offered and that they have not yet formally accepted. This is how most genuine responsibilities are acquired, not through conscious decision made in comfortable conditions, but through the pressure of actual need, encountering actual capacity, leaving the person at the intersection of those two things with very little room for the hesitation that more comfortable circumstances might permit. His encounter with Caecilius in the New York Sanctum was his first direct experience of conflict at the level that the mystic arts made possible, and it was disorienting in the specific way that all genuine first experiences are disorienting, not quite like the preparation for it, not fully consistent with what the imagination had constructed in advance, demanding adaptations in the moment that no amount of anticipatory thinking could have fully provided. He survived the encounter not through superior capability. Caecilius was a significantly more experienced practitioner, but through the combination of intelligence and creative improvisation that had always characterized his best thinking, and through the specific properties of the New York Sanctum itself, which he used with the instinctive spatial awareness that his enhanced perception made available. The mirror dimension became, during this period of conflict, something more than a subject of study and a territory of practice. It became a tactical environment, a space in which the rules that governed Caecilius's considerable power operated differently, where the advantage that raw magical capability normally provided was redistributed by the different physics of a reflected world. Understanding this, and acting on the understanding in the midst of a situation that allowed very little time for deliberate reasoning, represented a kind of applied intelligence that went beyond anything his surgical career had required of him. Not the careful, prepared precision of the operating room, but the faster and more improvisational intelligence of someone who must think and act simultaneously in conditions that are continuously changing. It was during these events that the Ancient One arrived, and it was here that Stephen Strange first witnessed her in the full expression of her power, not the measured pedagogical deployment of capability that she offered in teaching contexts, but the complete and unrestrained exercise of abilities that had been refined across a duration of practice that exceeded any ordinary lifetime. What he saw was extraordinary in every technical sense, a level of mastery so far beyond his own current development that it existed in a different category entirely, and watching it produced in him the specific quality of awe available to someone who has developed enough understanding of a discipline to recognize exceptional practice when they encounter it, even when that practice exceeds their own by an order of magnitude they cannot yet fully appreciate. But it was also during these events that something else was revealed, something that arrived not through any deliberate disclosure but through the logic of combat and circumstance, which has a way of surfacing truths that more controlled situations are able to keep contained. Caecilius, in the course of their confrontation, made a claim about the Ancient One that stopped Stephen Strange in the specific way that claims stop people when they contain something that feels, despite resistance, like it might be true. He said that she was a hypocrite. He said that the restrictions she placed on her students' access to certain knowledge, the boundaries she maintained around the dark dimension and its properties, were boundaries she had not maintained for herself, that the longevity she possessed, the centuries of continued existence that made her what she was, had been purchased through exactly the kind of engagement with the dark dimension's power that she forbade her students from pursuing. Stephen did not believe this immediately or entirely, but he did not dismiss it with the completeness that loyalty might otherwise have produced, because the claim had the specific texture of something that had been formed from genuine knowledge rather than invented for tactical purposes, and because his own developing understanding of the tradition's complexities had left him aware that the picture available to him was still partial in ways he could not fully map. He filed the claim in the interior space where unresolved things are held, and the holding of it changed the quality of his attention to everything that followed. The confrontation moved, through the specific logic of the forces in play, to a location that placed the Ancient One in circumstances that even her extraordinary capabilities could not fully manage. A fall from a great height in conditions that her physical body, for all its unusual resilience, could not entirely absorb. She was brought to the hospital where Christine Palmer worked, which was a convergence of the different dimensions of Stephen's life that the emergency produced without ceremony or preparation, and the medical situation she presented to Christine and her colleagues was one that their training had no adequate category for. Because the person on the table was not simply a person in the ordinary sense, and her condition was not simply a medical condition in the ordinary sense, and the relationship between what was happening to her body and what was happening to her in the fuller sense of what she was could not be captured by the instruments and frameworks of conventional medicine. Stephen stood in the space between his two worlds during those hours in the hospital, between the mystic arts that had been remaking him and the surgical medicine that had originally formed him, and the standing in that space produced a clarity about both that neither alone had offered. He could see Christine's competence and care with the appreciation of someone who understood exactly what she was doing and why it mattered, and he could see its limitations with the knowledge of someone who now inhabited a larger framework. And the combination produced a grief that was specific and not at all abstract. The grief of someone watching the best that one world can offer prove insufficient to a challenge that requires something the world he came from simply does not contain. It was in the Astral Plane, during those hours while Christine and her team worked on the Ancient One's body with everything available to them, that the conversation occurred which would remain with Stephen Strange for the rest of his life. Which is to say, given the nature of what he would eventually become for a very long time indeed. The Ancient One met him there with the quality of presence she had always brought to their encounters, unchanged by her physical condition in the way that presence on the astral plane is not constrained by what the body is simultaneously undergoing, and she spoke to him with the particular honesty available to someone who is no longer managing anything, who has set down the various responsibilities of leadership and teaching, and moved into the simpler and more direct relationship with truth that the approach of death sometimes makes possible. She confirmed what Caecilius had said, without defense or deflection, that she had drawn on the power of the dark dimension to extend her life beyond its natural span, that the hypocrisy her former student had identified was real and not invented, that she had made a choice she knew to be inconsistent with the principles she taught, and had lived with that inconsistency for a very long time. She did not ask him to forgive her for this, because she was not, at this point, in need of his forgiveness or anyone else's, She had done what she believed was necessary and had understood the full weight of what that meant, and had carried it without the comfort of confession for reasons that she explained to him with the same directness she brought to everything. She had extended her life because the world needed protecting, and because she was the person most capable of providing that protection, and because the alternative, a principled adherence to the boundaries she set for her students, resulting in her death at a natural time and the loss of the capabilities she had developed across centuries, would have left the world more vulnerable than a principled hypocrisy. This was not self-deception. She knew the argument's weaknesses as clearly as she knew its strengths. She had simply concluded, after long consideration, that the weaknesses were outweighed by the necessity, and she had accepted the cost of that conclusion in the specific coin it demanded, the permanent condition of someone who teaches one thing and does another, who cannot be fully honest with the people she cares about most. What she gave him in that conversation, beyond the honesty itself, was something more difficult to name, a quality of permission perhaps, or of trust, or of the specific kind of handing on that occurs when someone who has carried something for a very long time finally finds the right person to carry it forward. She told him that she had seen in him, from the beginning of his time at Kamar-Taj, something that she had not told him about because telling him would have been the wrong kind of instruction for someone at that stage of development. The potential for a greatness that was not simply technical, not simply a matter of capability, but something that had to do with the specific combination of intelligence and suffering and genuine moral seriousness that his particular history had produced. She told him that the arrogance she'd confronted in him on his first day had never been the truth of him, only the shell that had formed around the truth in the absence of adequate challenge, and that the months at Kamar-Taj had been doing exactly the work she had hoped they would do, which was not the removal of the shell by force, but the gradual creation of conditions in which the truth inside it could expand until the shell was no longer necessary. She told him that she had not always been able to see the future clearly, that the capacity for temporal perception that the mystic arts provided was not the same as certainty, that even the longest view available to her had always been partial in ways she could not fully map. But she said that she had seen enough to be confident in him, and that confidence was not a small thing from someone who had spent centuries developing the judgment required to assess human potential with genuine accuracy. She said that the hardest thing about dying was not the dying itself, but the not knowing, the inability to remain present for the events that would follow, to offer guidance in the moments when guidance would most be needed, to be there for the people she had invested in when the investments came due, and then, with the quality of acceptance that belongs to someone who's had a very long time to develop a relationship with impermanence, she let go, not dramatically, not with any gesture or declaration, but in the simple way that presence on the astral plane withdraws when the body it belongs to has passed the point of return. She was there, and then she was not there, and the space she left in the astral plane had the particular quality of spaces left by very large presences, more noticeable somehow than the spaces left by smaller ones, defined by the outline of what had inhabited them. Stephen returned to his body and to the hospital room where Christine was completing the final procedures that the situation required with the competence and care she always brought to her work. And he stood in the room with the specific quality of stillness that follows the receipt of something so significant that the ordinary processing mechanisms of the mind are temporarily suspended. Christine looked at him with the attention of someone who knows him well enough to see that something has changed, and did not immediately ask what it was, which was the right response and which he noted with the particular gratitude available for exactly the right response offered at exactly the right moment. The loss of the Ancient One was processed by the community at Kamar-Taj with the specific quality of grief that belongs to the loss of someone who has been present so long and so completely that her absence produces not just sadness, but a fundamental reorientation, a rearranging of everything that had organized itself in relation to her, which was, in the case of Kamar-Taj, essentially everything. Mordo's grief carried its own particular character, shaped by the revelation of her hypocrisy into something more complex than simple bereavement, a grief mixed with the specific pain of someone whose moral framework has been challenged at its foundation by the person they most respected, who must now work out what to do with the tradition they believed in, and a teacher they loved who turned out to be other than they had understood. Wang received the news with the contained quality that characterized all of his responses to significant things, the recognition that something very large had happened, held within the bounds of a composure that was not coldness, but the particular steadiness of someone who understands that the work continues regardless of what is lost, and that the best honouring of what has been lost is the continuation of the work. He looked at Stephen with the assessing attention he had brought to their relationship from the beginning, and what the assessment produced in his expression was something that had not been there before. A quality of reliance, subtle but clear, the specific adjustment in bearing that occurs when responsibility shifts, and the people who must carry it forward recognise each other. The conflict with Caecilius was not resolved by the Ancient One's death. If anything, her passing removed the single most capable defender from a situation that was still actively developing, and the resolution that remained to be achieved was now the responsibility of people who were less prepared for it than she had been, working with capabilities that did not match hers and with a clarity of purpose that her example and her final conversation had made available, but that the full weight of the situation had not yet fully tested. Stephen Strange stood at the threshold of that unresolved situation, carrying everything she had given him and everything he had developed across his months of practice and study, knowing that it was not quite enough and that it would have to be sufficient, which is the specific condition that genuine necessity so often produces, and that genuine character, when it has been properly formed, turns out to be exactly adequate to meet. And so the story settles, as all long stories eventually do, into the quiet that follows understanding, the particular stillness that comes not from the absence of everything that was difficult, but from the recognition that the difficulty was the point, that the loss and the humility and the slow, patient work of becoming something larger than you began were never obstacles to the journey, but the journey itself. Stephen Strange set out looking for his hands and found, in the losing of them, something that his hands had never been able to give him. He set out looking for himself and discovered, in the long quiet of Kamar-Taj, that the self-worth finding is always the one that forms in service of others. Let that thought rest with you now, as your breathing slows and the details of your own day grow soft and distant. Let the image of the sanctum settle around you like a warm and watchful presence, its ancient stones, its quiet garden, its guardian at rest. You are held. The world is watched over. And somewhere in the deep, patient architecture of things, wisdom is still being built from loss, and purpose is still being formed from surrender, and the work of becoming continues, gently, in the dark. Rest now. Sleep well.